evening's installment of the Jess Usher Memorial Lecture Series. I would like to give a shout out to the intrepid crowd from Bainbridge that made the perilous journey from way And I'd like to thank all of the local residents and the rather large number of faculty members that are here. My students, roll sheet is over there by the technician. Please make sure you sign up, otherwise you won't get your extra credit.
Yeah.
If you bribe them, faculty, they will come. Crime and punishment have been contentious issues since before the founding of the United States. Debates around them in the 18th century helped Britain to justify Georgia's settlement in 1732. Recent debates about the challenges of what's been termed mass incarceration has led to bipartisan measures, particularly the 2018 First Step Act and street protests with more radical demands making revisiting past histories of prison reform all the more important. Tonight, we will explore a conversation around prison reform in the mid-20th century Georgia that has been all but lost to history. That story included a diverse cast of actors, wasn't always pretty, and centered on the state prison at Reedsville. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Russell Pryor, is an associate professor of history in the Department of History and Political Science here at ABAC. He completed both a master's and a PhD in history at Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania and a BA in history at Columbus State University. He is from and specializes in the history of the U.S. South, especially rural Georgia. Dr. Pryor also regularly teaches courses on food history, social movements, and world history. In his free time, he enjoys to cook with, but mostly for, his wife, Lisa. And is an avid consumer of punk rock music, science fiction, Doctor Who, and Star Trek in particular, as well as old horror films. With insights into the Alcatraz of the Piney Woods, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Russell Pryor.
Figure out this contraption. All right. Thanks for everybody coming out tonight. Colleagues, friends, lots of students. I really appreciate y'all coming. I've been working hard on this. So first of all, I'm really, really happy to be here on a range of levels. It's an honor to be part of the series, particularly because it's called the Jess Usher Lecture Series. Hopefully some of you got the chance to meet Dr. Jess Usher. He was a great guy. He was a dear friend of mine. We lost him too soon. And a big part of this project emerged out of conversations that we had over a couple of years, right? I learned a lot from this guy. He taught me a lot about Southern history. He also taught me a lot about the responsibilities of historian, but also the responsibilities of a historian who's from the South. And I hope he'd like where I've taken this project in the months since he passed. And if he were still here, I think he'd have lots of questions, right? He hasn't been talking about. So, kind of like moving into where we're going, right? A quick note before we start. This is not going to be a pretty story, right? There's no way to get around it. Prisons are not pretty places. They're ugly. Where ugly things happen. And so I just want to get that out there from the onset. There's no way to get around it. So you've been warned. So we're going to start with 1943. On April 16th, 1943, prisoner stays a mass jailbreak at Georgia State Prison in Reedsville. 25 people escaped in one day. They planned for this for a bit. And they made keys, right? They didn't just escape. They made keys and they walked out, right? They made a break for it. This prompted the largest manhunt in Georgia history up to that point. This was a very public act that forced a hard look at Georgia's prisons. Reedsville is centered in Tappan County, right? So the Tatnall County, the grand jury convened, and they had to investigate, right, how did this happen? How did 25 people escape from a prison that was 6 years old, that was dubbed the Alcatraz in Piney Woods, that was supposed to be escape-proof, right? And what they found was a pretty disturbing state of affairs. They found really corrupt conditions sitting for the warden's office, right? Warden Robert Lawrence, who was the cousin of the former governor, Gene Talmadge, was apparently running bootlegging operations, right? There were 3 stills that were operating on prison grounds. There were gambling operations. There were narcotics running. And all this is going on inside the prison. Governor Ellis Arnold, who had been elected just the November before, in some sense on the heels of 2 successive governors who were very, very corrupt, right? Ed Rivers, extremely corrupt. Gene Talmadge, also very corrupt. Ellis Arnold, in a lot of important ways, was a reform governor, right? He was in some sense an anomaly in 1940s Georgia. So Ellis Arnold appoints a new warden. But as soon as this new warden takes over, you have another crisis, right? And it's like 2 months later, right? Most of the prisoners that escape are rearrested or reapprehended, go back to Reedsville. They think the story's over, but it's not. 3 more prisoners at a different camp, right? There's the state prison, and there's about 100 county labor camps all over the state. 3 prisoners at a county labor camp outside of Cartersville slash their Achilles tendons with straight razors, right? They do this as a protest, right? And this is something that can permanently cripple you, right? This is a desperate act. And they're doing this to draw attention to conditions at this labor camp. And the person they're trying to draw attention to is a warden, right? A guy named A.W. Clay. And A.W. Clay had a reputation in Georgia. He had been fired 5 years earlier by Ed Rivers for basically doing the same thing, provoking the same sort of reaction from prisoners at another prison camp. And he was already under investigation by the state of Georgia for doing the same thing at that prison camp, right? The prisoners weren't aware of that, and they were desperate, right? It's unclear what happens to Clay, right? He, of course, denies it. The media in Georgia, based on what happens at Reedsville, the conditions that are uncovered, what they see at this camp in Cartersville, they're incensed, right? There's a sense in Georgia that, yeah, you can commit a crime, you're going to do time, but you're still human, right? So along with this mass jailbreak and the Cartersville prisoners protest, they're going to force a conversation in 1943 about prison reform. And this conversation is going to force politicians in Atlanta into 3 separate investigations, comprehensive investigations, into the state of Georgia prisons. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to find damning evidence about Georgia prisons pretty much consistently. Right? The House report, for example, compares Georgia to 9 other southern states in 43 and basically says, quote, this is the worst we've seen everywhere, or the worst we've seen anywhere. And each report basically says the same thing, right? We need professionalized staff. We need to pay guards more, right? Keep in mind, this is during World War II. A big chunk of your workforce is in the military, right? 60 million American men have been drafted or have volunteered to serve in World War II, right? There's a shortage of labor. And part of what they're saying is if we want to attract good people to go and guard these prisoners, we have to pay people more, right? They're also going to say we need to ban, what amounts to basic torture influence. We need to stop chaining people together, stop putting people in leg irons, stop deliberately trying to humiliate people by putting them in stripes. But also, we supervise these labor camps. These labor camps are out in the middle of nowhere, where nobody knows what's going on. In September that year, on the basis of this momentum, on the basis of these three legislative reports, Ellis Arnold is going to call a special session of the General Assembly, right? And they're going to consider laws to implement serious reform to Georgia's prisons. And he's going to get votes. Part of the debate is not about whether or not to reform Georgia's prisons, but it's about the money, right? That's kind of the sticking point. It's not whether or not we want to change things, it's how much we want to spend on it. And basically what Arnold's going to tell people what he's going to tell the state legislatures is, quote, human rights and human needs are above budgets, right? We need to find the money. So why is this important? And this is like Exy, right? This is going to make national news. So what interests me about this is the conversation and the way it played out in newspapers, press conferences, legislative sessions, but also in prison yards, county work camps, and cell blocks, right? This conversation's taken place all over the place for like 30 years. And that's the story I'm going to try to tell tonight. The idea that prisoners were people, and prisons were fundamentally sites of rehabilitation, not retribution. That was the default in mid-20th century Georgia. And really it was the default in mid-20th century America, right? That was the common sense. And what you got here, right, this is if you go into Reidsville, granted Reidsville, the newspapers say that Reidsville's going to close this year, right? I was talking to my uncle earlier, and right, my grandpa was born in 1931. Reidsville was a fancy state-of-the-art prison when my grandpa was in kindergarten, right? This place is very, very old now. But when this place is built in the 1930s, right, 1937, it's opened. This is the frieze that's that's above the front door, right? It's by a Georgia artist, and it's called Rehabilitation, right? So this idea that prisons are about rehabilitation, it's literally etched in stone over the front door, right? This is not something that's debatable. This is not something that's sort of, oh, maybe prisons ought to be about this. They literally made it part of the building, right? And I think that's fascinating on lots of different levels. Because when I was looking through these documents, that's not what I was expecting to find, right? But the thing about words is, what do they actually mean, right? What does rehabilitation mean, right? How do we accomplish that? What does it look like? When you start talking about putting that into practice, how do you do that, right? How do you say someone's been rehabilitated, right? How do you say that a prison is accomplishing its mission? That's the rub, right? And that's where the debate is. And that's the conversation that's going on. And in the decades after 43, at least until the end of the 70s, that debate is very actively taking shape. Basically, every governor in Georgia, after 43, after Ellis Arnold, makes prison reform central to their mission. And politicians, prison administrators, guards, prisoners and their families, the media, courts, ordinary citizens, organized and not, took part in these conversations in different ways, at different times and with different results. So, as a historian, as a professor, I always make the point to my students that context is key, right? And Dr. Brown raised this point in his introduction, and I think this is especially important with looking at the history of Georgia, right? Georgia has a particular relationship to prisons. We weren't down as a penal colony, right? We're not Australia. But at the same time, Oglethorpe, right, James Oglethorpe, one of the key founders of Georgia, was a prison reformer. Right? His best buddy in 1729 died in a debtor's prison. And part of what he does out of this is it motivates him to head up a parliamentary committee that same year to investigate prisons in Britain. Right? And his argument is basically these prisons are horrible. They're essentially death sentences. Right? They're places where you go and you tuberculosis and you die. right? That's basically what these workhouses and debtors' prisons are. And he's going to say, too, that basically you go to jail in Britain because you're poor. And if you take a step back and sort of look at 18th century British law, they're essentially criminalizing poverty, right? That's a big part of what's going on, and that's part of the motivation for why people are moving, looking for better options in the Americas. And so part of his argument for establishing the state of Georgia, for the colony of Georgia, is to give people a second shot. Right? To give people an option not to end up in the workhouse, not to end up in debtor's prison. Right? That's the idea, and that's basically the idea for the first 20 years. And you've got them laying out the city of Savannah as a planned city. Right? This is sort of their utopia of what an alternative to prisons might look like. Fast forward to the 1750s, that vision kind of falls apart, and South Carolina essentially, or Georgia essentially becomes an extension of South Carolina. The plantation economy takes over, and you get sort of an interesting transformation in Georgia. But fast forward to 1804, right? 20 years after the Revolution, you got a serious debate in the U.S. about prison reform. Right? One of the legacies of British colonial law is we have a feudal criminal justice system. And by feudal, basically what I mean is you have a criminal justice system where inequality is etched into the law. Where if you commit a crime, you're branded, right? You're a criminal. And part of what I mean by that is, some of the punishments for committing a crime are mutilation. Right? You're going to get your ear cropped. You're going to be publicly humiliated by being put in a pillory. Right? And so part of what's being debated beginning in 1804 in the Georgia House, being brought up by the Georgia governor, is we need to revise this criminal code. They form a committee in 1811, and by 1816, we've got a new criminal code. And it's cutting edge. It's one of the most modern in the American South, one of the most modern in the country. Fast forward to the next year, on top of this new criminal code, we get a penitentiary. Right? And keep in mind that penitentiaries, they're new spaces, right? Prisons are new. You have holding cells. You have places where people are held before or after they're tried, but you don't have prisons in the traditional sense. Prisons are a creation, they're a reform that come out of the age of revolutions, the late 1700s, early 1800s. Right? And basically this is a place to reform, to transform individuals, to say we can save these people. And Georgia's part of that conversation, right? This is the first southern state to create a penitentiary. The other states that create a penitentiary are, Pennsylvania and New York. You got one in Philly, you got one in upstate New York. The Georgia experiment penitentiary lasts from 1817 to 1865. Right? And it's complicated, right? You got the idea of a penitentiary, you got the practice of a penitentiary, they don't always line up. And you've also got a couple of cases where the prisoners literally burn down the prison. Right? This is going to happen about 3 times. So again, there's tension and friction. Fast forwarding to 1866 to 1908, you've got convict leasing. Right? Convict leasing is brutal and ugly. This is a system that is rooted in experimentations with prison systems in the North and Midwest in the early 19th century. Right? Taxpayers don't want to pay for prisoners. We don't want to pay for prisons. So let's figure a way to make the system self-sufficient. Let's farm out prisoners to private companies, to private firms. Right? So this is something that, again, emerges in its sort of original form in the early 19th century. as it takes shape in Georgia and other southern states at the tail end, or I guess at the tail end of the Civil War, beginning of Reconstruction, it takes on a racial character, right? Because basically what you have is you have a system or an economic system that's destroyed. You've got 4 million people that were enslaved in 1860 that are free in 1865. And so part of what's taking shape is basically this is going to take on real racial overtones. Convict leasing is going to be banned in 1860, or rather, convict leasing is going to be banned in 1908. Hard of minds banned is organized labor and the populist movement. They don't like the competition, right? There's the argument that if convicts are working these jobs, free citizens can't get these jobs, right? So the state of Georgia is going to ban convict leasing. But what they're going to do is, after convict leasing, you're going to get the chain gang, right? And this is those county work camps. And the county work camps, in some sort of way, they persist into the post-war period, right? I'm not quite sure when they go away, right? That never really becomes clear. Maybe someone in the audience will talk about that. But those systems, those county work camps persist. So Reedsville gets established in 37, right? Sort of getting back to the main feature. And in some sense, Reedville's establishment in 37 represents a kind of a 71-year return to the penitentiary, right? There's a 71-year break where this conversation at prison reform, this conversation at the prison, kind of went on hiatus. But I think what's important to remember is just because you have a building, just because you're having a conversation at prison reform, doesn't mean that things get automatically better, right? Work still has to happen. And spending time in the Georgia State Archive, the director of prisons, or the director of Department of Corrections files, you come across a lot of things, right? These files are fascinating. There's a lot of junk, but there's also, you get a lot of insight into what's going on in prisons, but also what's coming across the director's desk, right? What he's seeing and his insights into what's going on in these prisons, right? In January of 44, he gets a letter from a woman whose son was in Reedsville, right? Her teenage son. She names the guard who beat him to the point of hospitalization, right? And she demands justice, right? I'm taking him to the Augusta University Hospital. Is the state willing to pay the hospital? Right? And the way she describes the beating, this was deliberate. The governor forwarded the letter to the proper channels and said something will be done. Exactly what was done, it's not clear, but basically, so this is her letter, but basically from the follow-up letters that are attached to that letter, it looks like nothing was done. Right? That's what I gather. And this is just to say that the talk of reform, it's operating within limits. Right? Just because you're having a conversation with reform doesn't mean that things magically stop being ugly. So let's jump ahead, right? Let's go to 1959, right? In July 1959, Georgia State Prison is going to erupt into a peaceful protest of a hunger strike. About 1,000 prisoners go on a peaceful hunger strike. They're to demand better food, limits on solitary confinement from 30 days to 20 days. And more rest breaks during work assignments. The ward at the time is going to be defiant and refuse to negotiate. And instead of negotiating, he's mobilized guards with riot guns, 18 carloads of state troopers, and buses to transport the strikers to the Buford Rock Quarry. And the Buford Rock Quarry is basically the place where you send bad prisoners, right? This is the bad place in the prison system. The director of the Department of Corrections, Jack Forrester, is going to back up this belligerent stance. And what he's going to say is, quote, the Board of Corrections and its duly appointed officials are going to run the prison for the protection of society. We're not going to let the prisoners run it, so we won't tolerate any violations of prison rules and regulations. But what's fascinating about this is if you look at the letters he gets, and his files for that year are full of letters from people all over Georgia, basically saying, why are you doing this to these people? These are people who are suffering under horrible conditions. They're not being violent. They're not hurting anybody. There are technically no rules against not eating. And you're treating them like they've stabbed somebody. Right? Why are you doing this? And there's lots of letters like this. A Columbus woman wrote, quote, I was under the impression that the code of the American court was justice with mercy. But that does not seem to apply in this case. I sincerely hope you'll consider your hasty decision to give these boys another chance. They don't, right? They're going to use labor at the Buford Rock Quarry and strategic uses of solitary confinement to break the strike, and they're going to brag about it to the press. The prisoners they send to solitary, and the prisoners they send, or rather, the prisoners they send to the rock quarry don't just give up, right? They're still determined. And just a week after they get there, the warden of the rock quarry is going to send 3 of the leaders of the hunger strike to solitary. And about 100 prisoners at that rock quarry are going to set down their tools and go on strike. Exactly what happens, the documentary record goes blank, right? And that's sort of one of the problems of being a historian is sometimes you just don't know what happens, right? Sometimes the chapter breaks off in a mid-sentence. The newspapers aren't reporting it, there's no evidence in the director's files, nobody else is talking about it, right? So it's unclear what happens, right? Where it picks back up is December of 1959, mid-December, right? 30 of these guys are still there, right? They sent about 120 there in July, 30 are still there. And they slash their arms open to protest, to draw attention to conditions, right? To point stitches. And I think part of what this example shows us is you've got, on the one hand, the politicians and Arnold sort of posturing and talking about reform and rehabilitation, but you've also got prison administrators trying to defend their terms, right? They're running the prisons. And they feel like that if they give an inch, that power might crumble, right? So there's a real tension there. And we're going to see that come up again and again in relationships between prisoners and guards and prison administrators over and over in the 60s and 70s, right? And that's part of that conversation too, and part of the limits of prison reform. So, 1963, you got another state commission study. And of course, the state commission study finds, quote, little to praise of Georgia's prison system, right? And it's one of those things where it's weird, like they have these studies every couple of years and they pretend like this is the first time they've done it, right? There's no historical consciousness whatsoever. They say Reedsville is great, right? The general prison system, not so great. Reedsville's fine. The place that's especially bad is a Buford Rock Quarry, right? That place needs to be shut down. It's, quote, unfit for the confinement of human beings, right? Seems like they got the message late. But if we're looking at the Buford Rock Quarry, what happened in '59 wasn't the first time that it happened, right? So what I did is I did a little bit of digging, and not just in Georgia newspapers, but over Time Magazine, right? This place had made national news multiple times in the 1950s. In 1951, 31 prisoners had collectively slashed their Achilles tendons with straight razors to protest their conditions there. And again, this sort of self-mutilation is very common in the early years of prison protest because they felt like that's all they had. All they could do was hurt themselves. In 1956, 41 men are going to smash their own legs with 20-pound hammers to protest conditions there. That's the one that made Time Magazine. And we've already seen what happened in 49 or in 59. That official condemnation was great, but it came a little late. And keep in mind that the Department of Corrections loudly defended Buford in 59 and said that it wasn't going to close in 59. You've also got a strike at Reedsville, right, in 63, right? So the prison that it's praising, you've got a strike there too. The protest could end with 36 guys going to solitary. One of the guys is so despondent that he takes a jacket as a button and tears open an artery. Right? The doctors revive him, they stitch him up, and they throw him back in solitary. He tears open the stitches with his teeth. It's unclear what happens, and again, the documentary record goes cold. We don't know what happens to this guy. But what we see taking shape around the same time, and sort of the reason that I'm sort of providing sort of the gory details, is we're going to see a shift in tactics. Because new avenues are going to become available for prisoners to challenge the conditions that they're living in and to fight in sort of interesting and different ways. And part of that's coming from the Supreme Court, right? There's 3 rulings that come out. Right? In 1962, Pate v. California says that states, not just the federal government, have to abide by the 8th Amendment. Right? And the 8th Amendment says that cruel and unusual punishment is not cool, it's not okay. Right? You can't torture people. And that's something, again, we get from saying how we don't want to be like the British. The next year, in 1963, Gideon v. Rainwhite allows prisoners to file writs of habeas corpus. And basically what that means is people... This is not my computer. So don't use that. So basically, writs of habeas corpus means people get their day in court. People can appeal their convictions. And keep in mind that a lot of these guys they're convicted in the Jim Crow South, and before 1963, they didn't have access to legal representation. Right? So yeah, some of them were probably guilty as all get out. But a lot of them didn't get a fair trial, and this ruling provides them to demand a fair trial. And a lot of them are. Finally, and this is the one that's really the clincher. This is the one that's most important for Reedsville. And for prisons all across the South. 1964, Cooper v. Pate. This is going to give prisoners the right and standing to challenge the conditions of their imprisonment under the 1871 Civil Rights Act. Right? And basically what this is they can form a class action, like form a group, and sue the prison and say you're violating our rights. You're violating our constitutional rights. You're violating our civil rights. And so if the state government's not doing what they're supposed to do, they can take it federally, right? And this is going to transform the conversation for like 25 years. Reedsville prisoners are going to make quick use of their new legal means of protest. From barely a dozen writs of habeas corpus in 1963, inmates are going to file 147 over the next 2 years. Quote, I don't know of any other state in the Union that handles as many writs, complained Reedsville City Court Judge Robert L. Carr. When I first took this job, when I first took over this court 11 years ago, we almost never had one. The Atlanta Journal dubbed Reedsville the, quote, habeas corpus capital of the U.S. in '65. New access to courts didn't stop other forms of protest, right? People still filed petitions. Lots and lots of petitions. They also wrote letters, right? Like this one. Some of them were intercepted, right? This one didn't make it to Mr. Hefner. I guess this guy read the articles. But it's not quite clear how many letters they sent. I assume they sent a lot, right? People were becoming emboldened in the prisons, but also people outside of prisons were becoming emboldened. Keep in mind too that this is the 1960s. This is a period of ferment. So let's go to 1967, right? This is kind of an interesting little tidbit, right? That's entertaining and I think says something about the situation, right? So April 1967, and this is another one of those 1943 style jailbreaks that I think kind of funny. So 1967, Lester Maddox is having an open house. Like he's just got elected. And he's having an open house, wants to welcome people to the governor's mansion, wants to have people meet the first family, wants to shake hands and kiss babies. He's a controversial governor. And this is a goodwill thing that he's trying to do. So something like 2,000 people walk through the governor's mansion, shaking hands, yada, yada, yada. And then these four guys walk in with one of these guys walks over to mom. And they turn themselves in to the governor. The governor's like, what's going on? And these guys escaped from prison. And they're turning themselves in. They're like, I'm turning myself in. And one of these guys, Booker T. Gary, who's 20 years old from Macon, when they escaped from one of these county labor camps, his mom made him turn himself in. Right? Because that's what a good mom does. And this is apparently where you're going to turn yourself in, is the governor's mansion. And part of what they're going to say is, right, Gary's going to tell the media, quote, it's not that we want to be free, we want better conditions. So, again, talk to Maddox. And Maddox is going to say, quote, if what they say is true, then shut the camp down. Right? Exactly what happened to this camp, it's not clear. The guy who runs the camp used some pretty nasty racist language talking about these prisoners. And it's unclear what happened. But again, what you got coming out of Maddox is Maddox is almost going to talk about prison reform. And if you follow the coverage of Maddox sounds a lot like Carl Sanders, who's his predecessor. And Carl Sanders is a moderate. And Lester Maddox, there's a lot of words one could use to describe Lester Maddox. And for those of you who are familiar with Georgia politics, you know what I'm talking about. Moderate is not a word you use to describe Lester Maddox. Right? Lester Maddox had just been elected as part of a backlash vote against the civil rights movement. Right? He was sort of a famous opponent of integration. He was not a moderate. But on prison reform, he sounded a lot like Carl Sanders. And he sounded a lot like his successor, Jimmy Carter, who was also moderate, right? Also not less dramatics. So this is just to say that this idea of prison reform, it's in the drinking water. So things change. So scandal persists. And you got a revolving door of prison administrators throughout the 1960s in Reedsville. A 69 federal court order is going to mandate racial integration at the prison. And that's going to happen, and it's basically just going to, it universalizes the head conditions. In 1970, Jimmy Carter's administration is going to make prison reform one of its central goals. Carter's going to work with the General Assembly to secure greater funding. He's going to appoint Ellis McDougall to head the Georgia Department of Corrections. Ellis McDougall is a nationally known prison reformer. This guy headed up the prison system in Connecticut. He headed up the prison system in South Carolina. He's somebody who speaks at these conferences, and he's a national figure in these circles. And he's somebody who people expect to come in and to clean things up. But he's going to come in at a moment when the Georgia prison system is in a state of upheaval, but not just the Georgia prison system, the American prison system is in a state of upheaval. And American cities are in a state of upheaval. American society is in a state of upheaval. But he's a well-intentioned reformer. He means well. Part of what's really going to set the stage for McDougall's arrival onto the stage are two events. One, you have a major prison uprising, strike at San Quentin. And the second is, in 1971, you have a prison uprising and with a very tragic end in upstate New York at Attica. Right? That's polarizing, right? So if we're thinking, going back to 1943, where these crises in prisons are, they're polarizing in some circles, in some sense, but they're not things that you like, they're not things that are fracture the nation, right? Attica, San Quentin, these are real polarizing events, right? And Attica is really going to put prison administrators and guards on edge, and it's going to put prisoners on edge too. McDougall is going to respond to the protests with an attempt to reimpose segregation. And basically, what we're going to see in the early 70s is this is a common sort of, these disruptions become common. And these crises become fodder for litigation, but it's also going to keep prison conditions in the public mind. Reedsville inmates understand very well what's going on outside, and part of what they're going to do is they're going to start referring to themselves in communications with journalists as Reedsville brothers, right? They're sort of understanding themselves as part of a broader prison movement. Shortly after Attica, McDougall's going to very soberly talk to the media and say, quote, there's no prison in the country where something like this couldn't happen. It's how long it goes on that makes the difference. He also went so far as to allege that there was some sort of national conspiracy to inspire prison rebellions, right? Commenting on that 1970 strike, the historian Larry Sullivan writes, quote, the importance of that strike is that it reflected a qualitative change in the prisoners' attitudes towards their incarceration and the prison itself. And this this line is key. The change rightfully caused fear in the hearts of the correctional officials because if left unchecked, it could transform the rules of the game. Something was changing in Reedsville, right? So what I've been trying to do is try to set the broader stage for these tensions, right? What's going to happen in Reedsville in '73 is things really explode, right? The climate nationally, the climate in Georgia is shifting, right? That conversation that we were having is becoming more polarized, it's becoming more difficult to have. On January 3rd, 1973, an entire floor of inmates, about 44 people, are going to take and hold 4 hostages and hold them for about 7 hours. Prison officials are going to mobilize 289 guards and 100 state troopers and try to retake the area almost immediately. For a range of reasons, part of it where the prisoners are at and how they got themselves barricaded in, the plan of attack fails, right? They're not able to get it. And because that assault fails, McDougal comes in and negotiates. He doesn't want to, but he does. And he brings about an end to the crisis. The way he's going to talk to the media is he's going to say, look, this is a violent act that was not thought out. It was blind rage, driven by hate. Right? That's how he frames it. And this is the well-intentioned reformer. If you look at his files, right, and part of what we have going on is with this litigation, there sort of emerges out of this sort of a massive class action lawsuit. Guthrie v. Evans, and these papers are housed at UGA, the Richard B. Russell Archives, and there's like tens of thousands of pages of documents that give you real insight into what's going on in prison in the 70s. So what we got is we have McDougal's statements to the media, but we've also got the petition that these prisoners had been working on for weeks that they presented to McDougal on the day of the hostage crisis. They had been planning this, right? And the demands were pretty well thought out, pretty articulate, and this was not a blind act of rage. Tactically, this was dumb, right? But they had thought this through. And basically what they're going to say is they want a prisoner observer committee with oversight powers, food, medical care, all the standard demands that they've been making for decades. But part of what you've got taking shape, unlike earlier periods where they're making these same demands and getting sympathetic play in the media, and getting a sympathetic hearing from politicians, things have changed. They're not getting that anymore. The conversation is shifting. McDougal is dogging them in the press. The Georgia media is talking about the hostage crisis in ways that kind of echo the way the parts of the press talked about Attica, right? Lots of rumors, lots of innuendo. If the prisoners didn't have their demands met, people's heads were going to be cut off, right? That was in some of the coverage. There's no evidence that was going to happen. None of the prisoners were harmed. But that's the climate they're operating in '73. What we're going to see is McDougal is going to make some promises, right? No one's going to be retaliated against. This is all going to be sorted out. Within a couple of days, most of these guys are in solitary. The battle lines are being drawn, right? We're getting to a point to where a conversation, a meaningful conversation at Reedsville, a meaningful conversation in Georgia is not really taking place anymore. Less than a year later, or I guess a little over a year later, November 1974, you got another crisis. And this is really sort of the last big political crisis of the prisoners' action at Reedsville, and then it's all over the course. You got strike. You got labor action. There is a bumper crop of beans and corn rules that basically say that working in the fields is volunteer and working overtime is volunteer. And the guards and the warden decide to ignore those rules because they need to get that crop in. And they're working 10, 12-hour days, right? And people decide to stop working. And so what's going to happen is, again, the warden is going to say, look, do what you got to do. Exactly what this conversation looked like is not clear. What we have is affidavits from the investigation that went into the event after the fact. But there was a meeting between the warden and the guards on duty that day, and they were basically given a green light to do what you have to do to get these people out into the fields. And they did that. Long story made short, guards roused people out of their cells, people that wouldn't leave, were beaten, dragged out in the yard, in the prison yard. People were crowded out of the yard, people were confused, not quite sure what was going on, very early in the morning. And at some point, somebody started shooting from one of the guard towers. And people started running and tripping over each other. A couple of people got hit. One guy, Andrew Griffin, didn't get up. Long story made short, the courts declared Griffin's death simply unfortunate and let matters go. This is the Reedsville incident, right? And this is the end of that conversation. And where we're going to go from there is basically we're really going to see the limits of reform. And see the process shifting from prison to the courts. And this is kind of where things get interesting in a lot of important ways, and where things move in a different direction, and the conversation really, really changes. So the aftermath of that failed 1974 strike underscores the limits of reform. But it also is going to underscore the fact that nobody is really ready to abandon that conversation. Right? The prisoner's going to file that class action lawsuit, but part of why it drags on for like a decade is the state doesn't want to give up either. Right? The state has lawyers. The state's going to pump a lot of money into fighting this lawsuit. And trying to remain in control of their prison to keep federal judges from telling the state of Georgia how it's going to run its prison. So Guthrie v. Evans is going to be a class action suit that's going to be in part worked on by NAACP attorneys. One of the attorneys that works on this was my former congressman, right, Sandra Bishop. He referenced Georgia, or he represents Columbus. And this suit's going to produce, again, thousands of pages of documents. And they're going to describe in these documents in lurid detail the conditions in Georgia prisons that, if you read newspapers and have been reading newspapers since the 40s, aren't going to shock you. Right? None of this stuff is new. And if you look back at the legislative investigations that the Georgia General Assembly has produced, every 5 or 6 years over the course of the past 30, it's in their reports, right? But part of what you've got is the fact that this conversation's happening in the federal court. It gives these old stories new weight. And in 1977, the federal courts are going to place the Georgia State Prison under a consent decree that's going to mandate a federal monitor. Basically, Georgia in 1977 is going to lose control over its prison. The federal government's going to come in and basically say, Georgia, you lost the right to run your prison. You can't do this anymore. But keep in mind that oversights don't just actually make things better, right? Building a new building doesn't make things better, and the federal government coming in and saying, we can do it better, doesn't make things better either. The monitors are going to remain there until 1985. And Georgia's going to be one of 9 southern states where this happens. The actions in Reidsville are going to take the actions in Reidsville are going to basically confirm that there's an impasse. So basically, what's the point? Put very simply, I think this helps us continue that conversation, right? If we're going to have this conversation in contemporary America, we need to have a historical context, right? We need to be able to have a sense that this is not the first time we're having this conversation, right? There is a background. We've had this conversation in Georgia, right? And I'll leave it at that.